Black teen saves baby from drowning. Her identity inspires the community. On a warm summer afternoon, a 16-year-old girl's quick thinking and unshakable bravery saved a life. But little did anyone know, the identity of this hero would ripple through an entire community. But how far can one act of kindness go in a world filled with assumptions? It was a bright, sweltering afternoon in the heart of a small suburban town, where time seemed to move slower than it did in the bustling cities. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and the air was always filled with a sense of familiarity. The local park, usually a place of laughter and play, now felt still. The sound of children's voices echoed through the trees, but today, something was different. The tension was almost palpable, an invisible weight that no one seemed to notice. It was on this very day that the unimaginable would happen, a day that would change everything for one family, and spark a story of heroism and unity no one saw coming. Among the crowd, 16-year-old Keisha Walker stood at the edge of the park, her eyes scanning the surroundings as she took a deep breath. She'd just finished volunteering at the community center and decided to take a quick break in the park. The sun was beating down, and the smell of freshly mowed grass filled the air. Nearby, a mother was keeping a watchful eye on her baby, sitting by the small, unguarded pool. Keisha, usually shy and reserved, would have passed by without a second thought, but today her instincts would draw her closer to a life or death moment. The tranquility of the park was shattered in an instant, when a single frantic scream pierced the air. Keisha froze, her heart racing as her eyes snapped to the source of the commotion. The mother, who had been watching her baby in the shallow pool just moments ago, was now scrambling towards the water, her hands desperately reaching out, her voice barely a whisper as she screamed, "Help! Somebody, please help!" In that split second, everything changed. Keisha's gaze darted to the water, where the small baby had slipped beneath the surface, motionless. Time seemed to stretch as if it had frozen. No one moved. A panic rooted itself in the crowd, people unsure of how to react. Some screamed. Others stood frozen, paralyzed by the shock of what was unfolding before them. It was clear that no one had anticipated something like this would happen, and the lack of immediate action only heightened the danger. Keisha's mind raced. Her feet moved before her brain could catch up, as the weight of the moment set in. Should she step forward? Was she qualified to help? But there was no time for hesitation. The baby's life was slipping away, and Keisha knew that the choice to act or freeze could mean the difference between life and death. In that moment, Keisha was no longer just a quiet teenager. She was the only one who could save the day, but would she? Keisha Walker was an unlikely hero. At just 16, she was often the quiet type, preferring the company of books and music over the chaos of crowds. Raised in a modest home by her single mother, Keisha had learned early on the value of hard work and humility. She had dreams of becoming a nurse one day, drawn to the idea of caring for others after seeing her own mother struggle through a difficult illness. Though her shyness often held her back in social situations, Keisha was compassionate and deeply attuned to the needs of others, even if she never said much about it. Keisha's mother, Maria, was the rock of their family, a woman who always put others before herself. Maria had instilled in Keisha the importance of giving back to their community, which is why Keisha had spent the past summer volunteering at the local community center. tutoring children and organizing events. Maria, who had been struggling with health problems, was often unable to help out as much as she'd like, but Keisha's support allowed her mother to rest easier. Despite her own dreams, Keisha's life had always been about helping others. She put others before herself without a second thought. The child at the center of the drama, baby Ethan, was the youngest member of the Mitchell family. His mother, Tanya, a single parent, had been watching him closely as he played near the pool, hoping for a moment of peace as she chatted with other parents at the park. Tanya was a hard-working woman who juggled 2 jobs to provide for her child. Her love for Ethan was the purest kind of devotion, and she had always been the one to put him first, watching him carefully as he grew and learned. And then there was the crowd, the bystanders who had gathered in the park that day. Most of them were well-meaning, but as the scene unfolded, their inaction stood in stark contrast to Keisha's bravery. The uncertainty of the moment froze them in place. It was easy to become overwhelmed by fear and doubt in a situation like this, but Keisha's unspoken determination was what made her stand out. With Ethan's life hanging in the balance, it was clear that Keisha would have to step into the role of a hero, even if she had never prepared herself for it. It started like any other summer afternoon at the local park. Children were playing on the swings, parents mingled by the benches, and the sunlight cast a warm glow over the entire scene. For the Mitchell family, it was supposed to be an ordinary day, one of those peaceful moments when life felt simple and everything was in its right place. Tanya Mitchell, a single mother in her early 30s, had been looking forward to this day, knowing her son Ethan could enjoy a rare moment of fun outside. Ethan, barely 4 years old, was as carefree as any child his age, running around with the other kids near the pool. Tanya had been talking with friends when she glanced over at Ethan and saw him standing too close to the edge of the pool. The water looked inviting, and the children had been near it for hours without issue. She turned back to her conversation, distracted for just a moment. But in that instant, everything changed. It was a split second, a brief moment of carelessness that turned into chaos. Ethan, intrigued by the shimmering water, lost his footing and fell into the deep end of the pool. Tanya's heart dropped as she turned back to find him struggling beneath the surface. He was too young to swim, and the water was far too deep. She screamed, but the noise of the park drowned out her voice. Panic set in as she darted toward the pool, but the distance felt like miles, and yet, amidst the blur of fear and confusion, something else happened, something that no one expected. Keisha Walker, who had been volunteering nearby, had seen everything. Her heart raced as she realized what was happening. Without a moment's hesitation, Keisha sprinted toward the pool. She had never been a strong swimmer herself, but the urgency of the moment overcame her fear. There was no time to think. As she reached the edge of the pool, she didn't hesitate to dive in, pushing past the rush of water that threatened to consume her as she dove deeper to rescue the child. At first, it seemed like an impossible task. Ethan was floating unconscious, his tiny body limp and vulnerable in the water. Keisha's mind raced. She had to act quickly, but how? She remembered the basic first aid and CPR lessons from her volunteer work. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the boy and pulled him to the surface, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. The other parents, who had been watching helplessly, finally began to stir, rushing to the pool's edge to assist. But it was Keisha who held Ethan, her arms wrapped tightly around him as she pulled him out of the water. When they finally reached solid ground, Keisha's thoughts became a blur of urgency. She checked for a pulse, praying that she wasn't too late. The other parents, realizing what was happening, called for an ambulance. In that tense moment, Keisha found herself holding Ethan's life in her hands, trying to keep her own panic at bay long enough to save him. The investigation into what happened that day would soon begin, though no one could ever have predicted how deeply it would affect everyone involved. What followed was not just the story of a heroic rescue, but one of mystery and conflict, one that would reveal much more than anyone had bargained for. The minutes felt like hours as Keisha held Ethan in her arms, waiting for the paramedics to arrive. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions. Had she done enough? Was it too late? The sirens could be heard in the distance, but every passing second felt like it might be too long. As she knelt beside the boy, her fingers pressed lightly against his chest, praying for any sign of life. His face was pale, his lips a faint shade of blue. Sweat formed on her forehead as she fought to keep her composure, telling herself to remain calm, to breathe. She had saved him. She had to have. Yet the longer Ethan remained unresponsive, the more her doubt crept in. Every moment felt stretched, suffocating. The once lively park had become eerily silent, as if the world had held its breath. People stood frozen around her, unsure whether to approach or keep their distance. It was as though they were waiting for something, some sign that things would be okay. But there was no sign, no reassurance. Tanya stood off to the side, pacing in agitation. She'd tried to keep herself composed for Ethan's sake, but it was impossible. Her eyes never left her son, who remained lifeless in Keisha's arms. Her heart pounded in her chest, a constant drumbeat of terror, as she stared at the young woman who had dived into the pool and pulled her son to safety. Keisha's expression was unreadable, and Tanya couldn't tell if she was worried or hopeful. In the silence that hung heavy in the air, every movement felt amplified, every second dragging with unbearable weight. The paramedics arrived in a blur, their uniforms a flash of color, as they rushed to Ethan's side. One of them immediately began checking for signs of life, their hands moving with practiced precision. The other focused on stabilizing Keisha, who had just collapsed from exhaustion, her body trembling from the shock of the situation. The entire scene unfolded in rapid motion, but every moment seemed suspended in time. Then, just as Keisha was about to be reassured by the presence of the paramedics, the unthinkable happened. The lead paramedic, his face stoic, looked up from his examination of Ethan and met Keisha's gaze. His expression, which had remained impassive throughout the ordeal, shifted subtly. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a question, perhaps even suspicion, that Keisha couldn't quite place. The moment felt heavy, but Keisha was too overwhelmed to process it fully. She watched as he instructed his team to prepare Ethan for transport, giving no indication of whether the child had survived. As the paramedics rushed off to the ambulance, Keisha found herself overwhelmed with an unsettling feeling. She had saved a child, yes, but there was something strange in the air, something that felt off, like a puzzle with pieces missing. In her heart, she believed Ethan was going to pull through, but she couldn't shake the nagging sense that the answers she needed were beyond her reach. Tanya had been standing still, staring at Ethan's fragile form, lost in thought. She hadn't heard the conversation between the paramedic and Keisha, but she saw the exchange of looks. She saw the hesitance in the paramedic's eyes as he quickly turned away. In the depth of her worry, she couldn't tell if it was concern for her son's survival or something more, something far darker than she had imagined. As the ambulance drove off into the distance, Keisha remained standing at the park's edge, her heart still pounding with adrenaline. Tanya, still reeling from the shock, turned her attention to her. She could no longer keep her thoughts to herself. "Who are you?" Tanya's voice was a mixture of gratitude and suspicion, as though she was searching for something, anything, to make sense of the terrifying series of events. Keisha froze for a moment, her eyes locked on Tanya's. The look was fleeting, but it felt like a recognition, a connection that both women didn't fully understand. Something told them that the simple act of saving Ethan wasn't the end of their shared story. The questions lingered in the air between them. Who was Keisha Walker really? And what was the paramedic hiding? The scene that had started as a routine day at the park was turning into something far more complex than anyone could have predicted. Questions were beginning to swirl. Questions about fate, about the truth, about the lives of everyone involved. And the answers weren't coming easily. As Keisha stood in the shadows of the park, watching the ambulance drive away, a deep sense of unease settled over her. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something was off about Ethan's accident. And now she was more certain than ever. Her instincts, usually sharp, told her that this wasn't just a random drowning incident. She had witnessed something, but what? And why had the paramedic's expression changed when he looked at her? Was he suspecting something? Just as she tried to calm herself, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Keisha glanced at the screen, her pulse quickening as she saw an unknown number. Before she could answer, the phone went dead. A strange chill washed over her. Who was trying to contact her? And why now? Meanwhile, Tanya stood alone, her thoughts racing. She tried to focus on Ethan's survival, but her mind couldn't let go of the image of Keisha pulling her son from the water with a calmness that seemed too perfect. Had Keisha really acted out of pure instinct, or was there more to her story? Tanya's suspicions began to grow, and she couldn't shake the idea that Keisha knew more than she was letting on. Was this all just a coincidence? Or was there a hidden truth buried beneath the surface? The mystery of that fateful day at the park was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The tension that had been building over the past few days reached its peak when the unthinkable happened. The discovery came not from the police investigation, but from a small, seemingly insignificant detail that had eluded everyone, except Keisha. A news report, buried deep in the local papers, mentioned something about a similar drowning incident occurring years ago, one that had been chalked up as an accident. The name caught Keisha's eye. It was a familiar one. The boy's name was Lucas Bennett, and he had drowned in a park, just like Ethan, under nearly identical circumstances. The police had closed the case quickly, convinced it was nothing more than a tragic accident. But now, Keisha realized, the pieces were starting to fall into place. There was a connection between the two incidents that no one had noticed, except her. Lucas's parents had moved out of town shortly after the boy's death. leaving behind only a few scattered details in the police records. But Keisha had lived in the same neighborhood for years and remembered the whispers, the rumors about Lucas's father. Ethan's drowning had unlocked memories she had buried deep within her. She had heard the same whispers about a family with deep secrets, a family that had left town far too quickly after a tragedy. As Keisha began piecing things together, a horrifying thought crossed her mind. Could it be possible that Ethan's drowning wasn't an accident? Was someone deliberately targeting children in that park, making them drown in the same way? The more Keisha dug, the more she felt the unsettling certainty creeping in. There was someone out there with a twisted plan, someone who knew how to hide behind the facade of tragedy. The investigation had been misled from the very beginning. The truth was far darker, and it was now staring her in the face. The weight of the discovery hung heavy over Keisha as she pieced together the horrific reality. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, the first emotional breakthrough was when she called the local police station to share her findings. The calm demeanor of the officer on the other end of the line did nothing to ease her rising panic. His voice cracked when he finally understood the gravity of what she was saying. "We need you to come down to the station," the officer had said quietly, a tone of urgency suddenly evident. "You've just connected dots that have been overlooked for years. This is bigger than we thought." Keisha's heart raced as she hung up the phone. A chill ran through her, not because she feared for her safety, but because she realized that the story of Ethan's drowning had become much darker than anyone had ever imagined. And in that moment, a strange feeling of guilt gripped her. She had brought this all to light. What if she had been wrong? What if, by uncovering this hidden connection, she was dragging an innocent family into something they could never escape? Her emotions were torn. She had been the hero, the savior of that baby. She had acted in the moment without hesitation. But now she felt that same sense of urgency gnawing at her gut, reminding her that it wasn't over. Her discovery had brought more pain and fear into the lives of those she loved, and yet it had also uncovered a dark truth that demanded to be faced. The tension mounted as Keisha stared at the investigation files before her. The weight of what she was about to uncover was unbearable. The thought that Ethan's death might not have been an accident was now etched into her mind with terrifying certainty. Her breath quickened, and she could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. The investigation had just entered a new phase, and this time it was personal. The stakes were higher than ever. As the investigation progressed, Keisha found herself at the crossroads of moral decisions, ones that weighed heavily on her conscience. She had become more than just a witness. She had become the one who knew the truth. The question of whether to reveal the chilling discovery about Ethan's drowning was no longer just about seeking justice for the baby. It was about facing the fallout for everyone involved, including herself. The first confrontation came when Keisha sat face to face with her own family. They had been supportive through it all, but now that the investigation was escalating, the room felt colder, their faces more anxious. Her mother, Donna, had tears in her eyes, her voice shaking with the intensity of the situation. "Keisha, baby, do you know what you're doing?" Donna asked, her voice breaking. "This is no longer just about saving a child. It's about exposing truths that no one is ready to face. What if you're wrong? What if it costs more lives? Keisha paused, her fingers trembling on the table. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, but Keisha couldn't turn back. She had to make this decision, not just for Ethan, but for the community that needed to know the truth, however painful it might be. The next confrontation occurred when Keisha stood before Detective Lawson, the lead investigator. She handed him the files she had uncovered, her heart pounding as she looked into his eyes. "You have no idea what you've just unearthed," Detective Lawson said, his voice low and serious. He was calculating. Considering the magnitude of her findings, Keisha saw the weight of his words settle in the air between them, and she realized that there was no turning back now. The choice had been made. The truth was out, and nothing would ever be the same again. The aftermath of Keisha's decision was as turbulent as the storm that had swept through the community in the days following Ethan's rescue. Once the truth about the events leading to the near drowning came to light, it set off a chain reaction that no one had anticipated. Detective Lawson worked tirelessly to follow the leads Keisha had provided. What started as a personal discovery soon became a full-scale investigation. The revelation that the drowning was not an accident, but a result of negligent behavior by someone close to the child, shattered the community's perception of their own safety. The individuals involved in the cover-up were soon identified, and the truth about Ethan's family dynamic unraveled piece by piece. What had appeared to be a perfect household was now marred by lies and the danger of further violence. As the investigation gained momentum, the authorities were forced to confront the brutal truth. The family members who had been complicit in the near drowning were apprehended, and the case moved to trial. The courtroom was filled with tension as the prosecution laid out the evidence. Keisha sat in the gallery, her heart racing as she saw the guilty parties face the consequences of their actions. But it wasn't just the criminal charges that weighed on her. It was the emotional toll of her role in exposing the darkness within her own community. In the weeks that followed, Ethan's family struggled to rebuild, not just from the public scandal, but from the emotional devastation that came with the revelation. Ethan's mother, once a pillar of the neighborhood, now faced the reality of losing her reputation and dealing with the trauma she had inflicted on her own son. For Keisha, it was an experience that changed her view of trust and justice forever. She was no longer just a local teenager who had saved a life. She had become a symbol of courage, of standing up for what was right, even when it meant facing a harsh and unforgiving reality. While the community had been shaken, Keisha knew that it had emerged stronger. People began to talk more openly about the issues surrounding family dynamics, accountability, and the often hidden darkness that can dwell in even the most familiar spaces. It wasn't the fairy tale ending that many had hoped for, but it was the truth, the kind that healed in its own painful, honest way. Keisha's life transformed in ways she had never anticipated. While she had always been known for her quiet demeanor and academic prowess, her heroism in saving Ethan from drowning and her pivotal role in exposing the truth left an indelible mark on her. She became a symbol of strength and integrity, but with it came the weight of public scrutiny. Despite the recognition, Keisha struggled with the emotional aftermath of her decisions. She often found herself reflecting on the cost of truth and justice, wondering if she had pushed too far in exposing the family's secrets. Yet, when she saw Ethan finally recovering from his trauma, no longer haunted by the shadows of his past. Keisha knew that her actions had been necessary. As for Ethan's family, their fate was far more complicated. His mother, once seen as a respected figure in the community, faced the breakdown of her social standing. She attempted to rebuild her life, but the weight of her actions was something she could never outrun. Ethan's recovery, however, offered hope for their future. It would take time for the family to heal, but they now had the opportunity to rebuild brick by brick. Keisha, on the other hand, moved forward, carrying the lessons of her journey into adulthood, always reminding herself that doing what was right often came with unexpected consequences, but also profound rewards. In the end, the cost of exposing the truth was high. Keisha learned that while justice can heal wounds, it can also leave scars. The community, once united by shared values, had been forced to confront the darker sides of its members, and in doing so, it had fractured. Yet, the moral of the story was clear. Standing up for what is right, no matter the cost, can create a ripple effect that changes lives for the better. But in the quiet moments of reflection, Keisha couldn't help but wonder, did the truth always bring peace, or did it sometimes leave a trail of unhealed wounds? The tragedy and heroism of that fateful day lingered in the minds of everyone involved, leaving a lasting legacy. Keisha, though changed forever, walked away knowing she had made the right choices. And while Ethan's future was uncertain, there was one thing that remained certain: the courage to face the truth, no matter how difficult, would always be the light that guided them forward. The town would eventually heal, but the lessons learned from this story would echo for generations.